Recently, I came across a video where someone boldly said, any parent who hasn't flogged their child hasn't completed scripture. And I'll be honest, my spirit paused because that statement and the mindset behind it has echoed across generations. We've had it in homes, in schools, even in pulpits. And yet, so often, it's repeated without any understanding of what the Bible actually means when it talks about the rod. So today, we are going to bring light to this, not with judgment, not with argument, but with grace, honor, and truth. Let's start with something that might surprise you. That famous phrase, spare the rod and spoil the child. It's not even in the Bible. You heard me right. That line actually came from a 17th century poem by a man named Samuel Butler, not from the scripture. Over time, people started quoting it like it was gospel truth. And somewhere along the way, it crept into our theology and our parenting. But the Bible never said that. What it does say in Proverbs chapter 13 verse 24 is this. Whoever spares the rod hates their child, but the one who loves their child is careful to discipline them. And that's where the misunderstanding begins. Because when we hear the word rod, we immediately think stick, cane, we think punishment, we think pain. But the original Hebrew word used there is shibet. And that word doesn't just mean a stick or weapon. It means shepherd's staff. The shepherd's rod wasn't meant to beat the sheep. It was meant to guide them, count them, protect them. That's why David said in Psalms 23, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Pause on that for a moment. David said, comfort me, not terrify me. That tells us something powerful. If a child or even a believer only feels fear under correction, then we've stepped outside of God's heart. Because God's discipline doesn't break bones, it builds character. His correction isn't punishment, it's positioning. And his rod doesn't bruise, it brings back home. This revelation stayed with me so deeply that I wrote about it in my book, Beautifully Broken, in a chapter called The Rod Misunderstood, When Love Looks Like Fear. This is the book, Beautifully Broken. I remember writing these words, and they still move me today. What if the rod was never meant to bruise? What if it was actually a shepherd's staff, a tool to guide, to protect, to gently nudge sheep back on track? What if discipline was always meant to look more like wisdom and less like warfare? And that question still burns in me because I believe for too long we've mistaken control for care and punishment for parenting. The rod was never a symbol of violence. It was always a sign of vigilant love. Even the Apostle Paul echoes this truth in Ephesians chapter 6:4, when he writes, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger and bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That means correction was never meant to silence, but to restore. It was never meant to bruise, but to build. Homes were never designed to echo with fear. They were meant to become sanctuaries, places where identity is formed, not fractured, where boundaries are safe, not suffocating. Maybe you grew up like I did, in a house where the rod meant fear. Maybe your scars aren't physical, but emotional. Words that cut deeper than any cane. I can still remember the sound of my father's cane, and he might watch this video today, that made my whole body tense before it even landed. But truthfully, it wasn't the stench that broke me. It was the silence after. That unspoken rule. Don't cry, don't complain, don't feel. For years, I thought that was love. I thought that was what God meant when he said, spare the rod. But it wasn't love, it was fear. And it took years of healing, unlearning, and surrender to realize that my Father in heaven doesn't raise his rod to strike me. He stretches it out to guide me home. That revelation changed everything. Because now, when I talk about God's rod, I don't see punishment, I see protection. I see a shepherd who defends his sheep, not destroys them. As I wrote in Beautifully Broken, children are not rebels waiting to be subdued. They are seeds to be nurtured, souls to be stewarded. That's the Father's heart. And even psychology agrees, children don't flourish under fear. They flourish under love. Fear might control behavior for a moment, but only love transforms the heart for a lifetime. So maybe it's time to reimagine the rod, not as something to strike with, but something to guide with. Not a weapon, but a witness of wisdom. You see, beating a child doesn't change them. It conditions them. It doesn't teach transformation, it teaches survival. When you train a child with harshness, they learn to respond to harshness. They don't grow in understanding, they grow in fear. They start anticipating anger instead of embracing instruction. And even when they appear calm, their hearts has already withdrawn. But when you train a child with gentleness, they learn to respond to gentleness. They learn that boundaries can exist within love and that love doesn't require fear to be respected. I've always said it. And I've always said this. I would rather raise a child who listens to my counsel with one word than one who only listens when I raise my hand. Because some children won't obey you until you beat them. Not because they are stubborn, but because that's how you've taught them to respond. You've trained them to obey pain, not instruction. And that's not discipline, that's conditioning. Then there are children who respond to a single word. Not because they fear you, but because they trust you. Trust is the soil where true obedience grows. Now, someone might say, I've tried gentle parenting and my child is still stubborn. Well, sometimes it's not the child we need to examine, it's ourselves. Because children rarely do what we say. They imitate what we live. If you want your child to be respectful, listen to how you speak to your own parents or even your own husband. If you want your child to manage anger, watch how you manage yours. If you want your child to learn honor, observe how you treat authority. You can't preach peace and model war. Before you pick up the cane, pick up self-awareness. Before you raise your hand, raise your prayers. I was beaten and it didn't stop me from making mistakes. If beating could change a child, it would have changed me. But it didn't. What changed me wasn't punishment, it was prayer. What transformed me wasn't fear, it was grace. Sometimes the greatest discipline isn't in the hand, it's in the heart. It's not about breaking a child's will. It's about building their wisdom. Turn your beating into prayers. Let God train that child, because there is far more harm that beating does to a child than good. It doesn't shape behavior, it shatters trust. And once a child starts obeying out of fear, you've lost their hearts. Even if you've gained their silence. So train with love, lead with grace, correct with calmness, and pray with faith. Because the rod of God, the true rod, was never meant to bruise, but to bring children home. To bring his children home. Here's the truth I want to leave with you today. You are not the bruises you carried. You are not the silence you swallowed. You are not the obedience born out of fear. You are the healed. You are the chosen. You are the beautifully broken, rebuilt by glory. The childhood script that told you love must hurt is being rewritten. And the author of your story, he doesn't write in bruises. He writes in grace. I pray this message meets you with light and love. If it spoke to your heart, share it with someone who needs to know that God's correction isn't rejection, it's restoration. I'm Deborah Elroi, your soul doctor, and this is Healing Moves.
Drop a comment below. How has this reframed biblical principle for you? Have you experienced the rod as guidance rather than punishment? And if this brought healing or new perspective, subscribe to War Room Heaven for more conversations that transform pain into purpose.